Welcome to our first series of virtual readings from the climate fiction anthology, Our Entangled Future, Stories to Empower Quantum Social Change. My name is Leonie Goodwin and I work at Sea Change, a research and values-based organisation working out of Oslo to generate and inform transformations to sustainability. So we're delighted to welcome you to today's readings. But before we get started, just a few practical things. Could everyone please mute themselves when they're not talking? We have turned off the chat function among participants during the readings, but we'll open it up again when we get to the discussion. So if you have a question, you can send it to the hosts during the readings, but otherwise, once we open up the chat function, you can type it in there. And you can also use the raise hands function when we invite questions from the audience. And just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. And the link will be sent out after the call. So I'm going to hand over to Karen O'Brien. She's one of the co-editors of Our Entangled Future. She's a professor of human geography at the University of Oslo and a co-founder of Sea Change. And she's passionate about inspiring people to engage in equitable and sustainable transformations and the potential arts and quantum social change offer for addressing climate change and sustainability challenges. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you, Leonie, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining the webinar today. I'm really excited to be here and where we have 5 authors who are going to present readings from Our Entangled Future, Stories to Empower Quantum Social Change. And they're going to share excerpts from their stories. And we really hope that you'll be inspired to read more. And we're going to follow this with a facilitated discussion and also some questions, and also a short creative writing exercise. So have a pen and paper nearby for this exercise that Nicole will lead. But before we start, I just want to say a few words about this book project and what is different and what was so fun about it. It's part of the Adaptation Connects research project that I lead at the University of Oslo here in Norway. And Connect stands for combining old and new knowledge to enable conscious transformations to sustainability. And what we're interested in is how we can transform successfully to respond to climate change and other global challenges, including biodiversity loss. And ultimately, it's a call for adaptation as transformation. So in the project, we're looking at the role of creativity, collaboration, empowerment, and also the flexibility of narratives in supporting transformative change. And that brings us to this book project. My co-editors, Anne and Nicole, and I share an interest in quantum social theory and what this paradigm has to offer to our understandings of social change. We think of quantum social change as a nonlinear, non-local approach to sustainability transformations. And we recognize that stories play a really powerful role in helping us to imagine and envision possible, probable, and preferred futures. And also stories have the potential to help us realize our own potential in creating these like alternative, not yet here realities that will enable people and the planet to thrive. So I think this is really involves questioning dominant modes of thinking, relating, acting, and governing. And most of all, I think the stories draw attention to the patterns and relationships that are shaping our entangled future, and not the least our role in creating these patterns. And so the metaphors that are borrowed from quantum physics, like quantum leaps and superpositions and entanglement, they offer us new ways to think about our interconnections or interactions, but it's also in ways that are familiar to indigenous knowledge and many wisdom traditions. But probably most important is that entanglement is much more than a metaphor. It is the nature of reality. And quantum physics is telling us that reality is not what it seems, and that we haven't really absorb this as a society and considered what it means for our relationships, whether it's our relationships to ourselves, each other, nature, or to social change. So we put out a call for short stories in the fall of 2018, and we had really no idea about how many submissions we would receive. And some of the anthologies on climate fiction received hundreds of stories, and quantum social change, we didn't know if we would receive any. We did receive almost 40 stories, and as you'll see from the ones that made it into the books, these are creative, inspiring, and most of all, empowering. We also received some queries or questions about whether we would accept artwork. And that led us to pair each short story in the book with a piece of artwork. And so we self-published the book, and you'll see that you can download it for free or purchase it at an online bookstore. We launched it in 2019 in October at the Transformations 2019 conference. And so overall, I'd say that this was just a really fun project because people would come up to me at conferences or in other arenas and say, I didn't submit a story, but it really got me thinking about what story I would write. And then this brings us then to the stories that are included in the book. And so we're really honored to have 5 of the authors with us today to read from their stories and talk about the creative process and like their potential for social change. And I see that in the audience, we also have some of the other 4 authors who will be presenting at a second webinar on Friday, May 21st. So I'm going to pass this over to Nicole to introduce the authors, and then we'll get to hear their readings. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Karen. So as Karen was saying, we have an incredibly talented lineup of writers that I'm thrilled to be introducing today. Our contributors to this anthology span the globe, and for our series number 1, for today, we're really thrilled to be presenting Jessica Wilson, who's based in South Africa, Jude Anderson and Chris Reedy, based in Australia, Kelli Rose in Italy currently, Saher Hasnain joins us from Pakistan. And each of these writers bring a wealth of experience to their writing as accomplished academics, artists, activists, world travelers, and community builders. And most importantly, they each brought a very unique perspective and found their own way to animate these concepts of quantum social change that Karen was speaking to. So I'm really thrilled to first up be introducing Jessica Wilson. Jessica is a writer and an environmental justice activist. She is deeply committed to social change generated through social learning and collective action. Her political advocacy is complemented through a regular meditation practice and exploration of the nature of the mind. She has written extensively on climate change, water security, social movements, and deep democracy. And Jessica will be sharing from her story, The Drought. So over to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to go straight into the reading. Some say the place where the change began was Cape Town, a violent, sprawling city at the tip of the African continent, known for its beauty. Others disagree. There was no beginning. There was no single place, they say. Time wraps in on itself. Everything is connected. It is true that there was a period when the rain didn't fall. For 7 years in a row, the winter rains that usually fill up the cliffs and valleys of the Cape Fold Mountains didn't come. The fynbos barely noticed. Used to endless cycles of drought and fire, the plants making up the richest floral kingdom in the world continued to breathe and blossom. And, initially paying no heed to the cloudless skies, the residents of Cape Town topped up their chlorine-enriched pools and watered their English green lawns. Eventually, all the officials and machines and networks and politicians and monitoring equipment and forms that made up the city's neural network noticed. "We are going to run out of water," they cried. The residents of Cape Town sat up and took notice. Their noticing echoed throughout the planet. As if waking from a deep sleep, humans who for centuries had channeled rivers, dammed valleys, chopped down forests, thrown poisons onto the earth, exhumed and burned fossilized plants, rubbed their collective eyes and looked around them. It was not a pretty sight. The earth was parched, and where it wasn't parched, floods were amassing, fires raging, winds howling, and the sea lapped hungrily at the land. "Poor us," they cried. "What have we done to deserve this?" But the answer was there for all to see. They had disconnected their thoughts from their feelings, themselves from each other, their species from the web of life, and their souls from the sacred. And they had projected this peculiar and sad form of reality onto a self-aware living cosmos of which they were a part. Back in drought-stricken Cape Town, the mayor proclaimed that day zero was imminent. The last drops of water would be rationed at collection points under military control. And that, some say, is when it happened. The neighborhood WhatsApp group started to buzz. Messages of love and solidarity soon crowded out the texts of fear and racism that had long dominated the groups. Before long, the entire social fabric of the city changed. With common intent and purpose, as well as some breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, the need for cell phones disappeared. People could communicate with each other at will by switching on or off certain parts of their brains. Without the endless demand for rare earth elements, silver, gold, and other minerals, conflicts around the world came to a halt. Children in Central Africa were allowed to grow up without being initiated into child armies. Women were safe from the violence of men. Or so the story goes. Whether it happened in a moment or over centuries, no one could say, but everyone agreed that when the seas rose to their maximum height and the earth reached its hottest temperatures, things were different. The human species changed. The age of greed and narcissism ended, and the time for cleaning up their mess began. Since infanthood, all children were taught to work with their mind, body, and emotions. A trickster at heart, Karipi had not always done her homework diligently. She had seen no need, preferring to run wild in the cliffs and cliff faces. And the organism had let her run. Wildness, freedom, sensuality came directly and unbidden through certain beings, refreshing the life of the collective. But now in the tidal pool, Karipi felt desperately alone, abandoned. She could not sense anyone, anything, any awareness. She fell into a fathomless space of pure terror where images flooded her mind. Huge buildings belched toxic smoke surrounded by a wasteland of dead earth. Monospecies plantations stretched for miles and miles in which not a single bird sang. Children, covered in blood and mud with guns longer than their torsos, crept in terror through the shadows of dunes. These and more tumbled through her mind, and in each she was not only the observer, but also the last fish eagle to be born, the child whose limbs were blasted off by a landmine, the river desperately trying to rid itself of poisons, the oil baron who hanged himself. The feelings were unbearable, and still they came, faster and faster, more and more intense, until she had no idea who she was or where. Her toes continued their tenuous grip on the rock as her body was pounded in every direction. A massive wave, bigger than all the others, came over the wall. Its reach was so long that it crashed directly on her with the full power of the deep ocean.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really love how with your story, how you bring all of these complicated ideas into the body of this young girl and her journey as she travels through this shift in collective consciousness. Thank you so much, Jessica. So as we, after we get through all of our readings, we're going to be able to move into a panel discussion where we're going to be able to explore some of these ideas more. So jot down your questions if different questions come up for you as you listen to each of our authors. So up next, I'm very pleased to introduce Jude Anderson as our second author in today's reading series. Jude is a seasoned artist, and her professional career began 25 years ago while directing a text-based site-specific performance in France. Her work has been commissioned by renowned European festivals. She has worked at all levels of the Australian live art ecosystem and has led practice laboratories and presentations across Europe, South Africa, and Australia. She's the artistic director of the live art company Punctum, which she founded in 2004. And so Jude will be reading from her short story, Cool Burn and the Cherry Ballart.
Hi, I'm not going to read off the screen. I'm much better reading from a compressed version on paper. I am speaking from Jara country. land of the Jajawarang in central Victoria. From the shade of a white cedar on the banks of the Shoalhaven River, which rose in Australia's Great Dividing Range and plunged 327 kilometres through Yuin Nation ancestral lands to emerge into the Pacific Ocean at Nowra, Ado said, "There's no difference. My people, my story, Wandian clan, how we connect to country, respect it, our law, our language, creation stories, it's all one. We learn here on country, Dharawal language country, on special sites." It was never terra nullius, a legal status declaring land unoccupied, conveniently paving the way for its colonisation. 5 generations back, settlers arriving by boat, like my ancestors, had not often shared, they'd taken. And here, they'd massacred and taken. Being twisted, the huge tree we were sitting under had survived. Ado said, "Before I do anything in country, use the water, get some food, collect plants, I speak to it, to show respect." Does what you say change with what you're doing? I just say thanks. How do you say thanks in Dharawal? Just quietly, under my breath. We laughed. Yudunji. It was Thursday, December the 6th, 2018. As an artistic director, I was part of a group of artists working with a climate change scientist we had met 18 months earlier at a Water Futures symposium. We needed more time together, and I had proposed a residency at Bundanon Farm. We were now sitting with Ado in the quietude of a riverbank which framed the farm's southern boundary. Violent storms had ripped through the area 1 week beforehand. The build-up season in the far north had spilled into the first cyclone, whose southern reach was long. But now it was hot, still, and apart from the pulse of cicadas and the metronome beat of the bronze-winged pigeon's sigh, it was quiet. Ado looked across the river to the opposite bank. In the calm of his gaze, I thought of the settler violence, the noise of violence, the bloodletting, timber felling, the loss, and then Ado whispering in Dharawal. Sometimes I touch it, whatever I'm collecting or using or sharing, sometimes I touch it and say thanks. And then you drink it or eat it, share it? Yeah. How do you know how much you can take? We just take what we need. Others come after, so we drink and eat, collect medicine, keep warm, just take what we need. And then, depending on the season, whether it's a good one, you read it, what you can take, what you leave. You read what's been left so you can let it regenerate. If you found a big pile of oyster shells, you'd catch fish. Ado looked down the river. What kinds of fish do you catch? From the river right now? None. They're contaminated, can't eat them. From all that rain and storm churn, no, fire retardant. Fire retardant? A wave of dread hit me. Ado was more philosophical. Yeah, it was dumped around a lot of places upstream last year. With the wash, fish upstream were contaminated straight away, but now it's been detected in fish right through here, all the way to the river mouth, so we don't touch them. It'll take time, and we don't know how long. On a late afternoon in spring last year, an out-of-control fire front was reported burning near Nowra. The whole state was in one of the worst droughts for a century, and this fire was a nerve-wracking early sign of an explosive fire season ahead. But now they were wanting to work with us and with them on our traditional burning, our cool burning, and that's pretty exciting. I was here for the cool burn on the farm just a couple of months ago. 500 of us mobbed from across the country getting together to share knowledge. It was awesome. No need to dump that fire retardant here anymore. From down the river, A couple of large water birds skimmed and tilted just above the water surface towards us in a play of aerodynamics and speed. In tandem, they flashed past, continuing upstream. I followed their flight, as did Ado. And then a fish somersaulted out of the water and flipped back in with a splash. The river fell quiet. Baju, water. Wagonga, beautiful water, blue water. Mumba Nand Tanya. I sat watching. It was time for the ceremony. A welcome to country is most often a cleansing using white smoke from the burning leaves of local symbolic trees. Ado had gathered some cherry Ballart branches. The thick white smoke from their bright foliage was aromatic. The cherry Ballart also grows on Jajawarung country where I live. Its use in welcome to country and cleansing ceremonies draws on the knowledge that the tree is a partial parasite, taking nutrients from its host plant without harming it. It is a powerful metaphor for visitors to country who are being invited to share the resources of the land while caring for it as if it were their own. It is also a reminder of the importance of cooperation between people if all are to prosper. The mystery of germinating the cherry Ballart seed has never been solved. After Ado welcomed us in Dharawal language, acknowledging his ancestors and inviting our shared respect for country, we each in turn stepped into the smoke drift and gently drew it toward and over our heads. A scooping of smoke in much the same way as we'd taken our first steps into the river, cupping its water and tipping it onto our skin ahead of a swim. We were cooled, cleansed, introduced to the Bangali, the Shoalhaven River, and welcomed to country. In the wisps and drifts of smoke and ceremony on this ancient gathering place in the Dharawal language lands of the Yuan Nation, where clans had come together over thousands of generations, the tendrils for our collective research were intertwining and wrapping around each other.
Thank you so much, Jude. I really enjoy how you bring us into this world through the structure of an exchange, and it really brings alive that idea of interconnection and entangling these two narratives, weaving together, and the way that you bring us into this way of knowing and being through centering Ado's knowledge and experience and teachings of indigenization. Thank you. Okay, so I would like to turn it over, to introduce Kelli Pearson. She's our third author in today's reading series, and she's joining us from Italy. Throughout her career, Kelli has focused on communicating themes of sustainability to wide and diverse audiences. In previous lives, she was the owner of a successful community cafe and events hub in Savannah, Georgia, and a consultant working in the field of regional economic development and sustainability. She's working towards her PhD, or she may already be finished at this point, on the topic of transformative imagination and leadership for sustainability. And she'll be sharing an excerpt from her story, The Legend of the Cosmos Mariners. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much, Nicole. So The Legend of the Cosmos Mariners is a children's story or young middle grade fiction. And I'll just launch right into it. Okay. The last note rose up with the sparks from the fire, disappearing into the starry sky. As it faded, the owl called again from somewhere in the forest. Hoo-ha-hoo! Arlo was surprised to find himself as mesmerized as the rest. The words were strangely familiar, and for some reason he felt tears prick his eyes. He blinked rapidly, pressing his lips tightly together, and let out a muffled humph. The others were all staring in wonder at Aunt Bloom. In other words, she continued in a no-nonsense voice, the Cosmos Mariners are people of all kinds who have taken a vow to spread truth and beauty and kindness in the world. They dedicate their lives to this vow, so they say. Well, as best they can. It isn't easy. A gleam came into her eye. According to legend, it's an ancient secret society. Do you know any real cosmos mariners? Sebastian interrupted. Were you listening, dear? Didn't I just say it was a secret society? They don't go telling their secrets to just anyone. Aunt Bloom chuckled. Oh, and by people, she added, I don't mean just human people. A tree, for example, can bring truth and beauty and kindness to the world just as well as anybody. Zella shook her head. Wait a second. She sounded skeptical. A tree is a person? Can cats be people? Fiona asked. Purring is like a superpower. Aunt Bloom laughed. Actually, trees are some of the best people. Mustn't forget the trees. Her tone left no room for contradiction. Cats too, she added with a twinkle, and dogs. Most dogs are just love with fur. Arlo brushed his hair out of his eyes, crossed his arms, and continued frowning into the fire. Aunt Bloom sat down on a log and clapped her hands together to get their attention. So, she said, her voice pitched high like a snooty school teacher. Cosmos mariners, much more pleasant to talk about than hungry ghosts. We'll start with a simple definition. Cosmos, C-O-S-M-O-S. She spelled out the word. The whole universe and everything. Mariners, M-A-R-I-N-E-R-S, an old-fashioned word for sailors. Cosmos mariners, people who sail through the universe. Her voice changed to a loud, dramatic whisper. People who feel the waves and the winds of life itself, like pirates. Good pirates, that is. Me, cried Fiona. I love big waves. Dad and Bastian and I went on a boat in the ocean this summer. I'm a pirate. Sebastian shushed her. Let her tell the story, Fee. Listen, my loves. Aunt Bloom put her hand to her chest. The hungry ghosts are very real and more powerful than ever before. Somehow they have convinced people that we are living on a cold, dead rock, drifting through space, and that a living being is no different than a robot, that we are biological robots, expendable, replaceable, that an air filter is just as good as a tree. Aunt Bloom snorted and paused for breath. This is nonsense, of course. To put it bluntly, time is running out. Our world is in great peril. With each word, her voice grew louder until she was almost shouting. If nothing is done, we will all surely die. In the pause that followed, even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Arlo gasped. Suddenly he heard a rushing vibration that sounded like an army of ogres. He closed his eyes and could see a giant wave towering over him. All his fears came flooding back. The storms, the fires, the death of so many animals. He had tried so hard to ignore this feeling. Now he was shaking and his knuckles were white from clenching his hands. It's just a stupid story. It's just a stupid story. The others looked horrified and angry. Aunt Bloom let out a heavy sigh that seemed to contain all the sighs that were ever sighed. We know how to save ourselves, how to stop it, but we hesitate. Why? Asked Zella, her voice quavering. They sat frozen in silence for a long moment. Aunt Bloom shook herself as if shaking off the gloom. It's scary. We're all scared, those of us paying attention. But listen, my dears, you can't be brave if you're not scared. Aunt Bloom's face brightened. And don't forget the Cosmos Mariners. This is where they come in. Their radiance and courage ripples through the interconnected tangle of everything, which makes the hungry ghosts lose power. They are our hope for the world.
Thank you so much. I love the structure of seeing this through children's eyes and tapping into that, the strength that we can find in heart space. Thank you. I'm going to introduce here Hasnain. She's a researcher with Food Systems Group at the University of Oxford's Environmental Change Institute. She is interested in global food transformation and the complexity of human influence in relation to it, the use of foresight, learning, and teaching to bring about sustainable and systemic change in food systems. Previously, she has worked as an environmental scientist and examined the interconnections of environmental health and urban design. Her professional and personal interests find overlap in her works of science fiction, and she'll be sharing from her story. Let us begin.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I also have a stutter, which tends to come out when I'm nervous, so I hope this isn't that time. But okay. She shook herself. The momentary homesickness agitated her connection. The people setting up the rug stall on her right looked at her curiously. They had sensed her unease. She smiled at them and moved on, spreading herself thinner and thinner into the mass of humanity on the festival grounds. Shadin, here! Ishar, her main trainer, waved at her from the central tent. She shook off her entanglement and went to him. They went inside. The rugs were set up and the students had arrived. The tent dwarfed the small group of people, one trainer to a student. Each pair held a map spread out in front of them. You have heard this many times from me now, but you need to have this hammered in. Nobody has done this before at such scale. Amreen looked at the pairs in the room. Already a tall woman, she towered over the seated students. Our reasons remain the same. The world is more complex than ever before. We need more ways of working together, of harnessing the power of human nature to solve our bigger problems. We needed to go bigger than those small incremental solutions that were the norm when I was young and which persisted into your youth. Recycle, go plastic free, eat vegan, but this is not enough. The trainers placed small white stones on the maps at specific points as she spoke. It was where each of them would be stationed. In my day, the closest we got to entanglement and connection was through the internet or through group religious activity. That last one was declining quite quickly even then. Kareem, one of the trainers, muffled a laugh. His father was one of the last remaining religious scholars in the region. Amreen walked around the room, pausing briefly behind each student. I remember a day when my sister and I were out in a market. We were standing at a stall, looking at shirts, I think. She was coming closer. Shadin's skin prickled. I only noticed the man when he was right behind me. Amreen's voice was directly behind her head. You wouldn't understand this, of course, and this shows me how far we've come. Latif will tell you about the neuroscience of all this, but what I felt was a presence, a looming, dangerous presence. Shadin was surprised. The very concept of someone being able to sneak up on you was alien to all the students in the room. They would have been aware of the person, even if they weren't participating in the entanglement. Amreen walked out in front of them and turned to face them. Women have always been viscerally aware of their surroundings, far more aware than men have had to be. We can feel eyes on us. We can feel when dangerous people, men, are around. My sister and I wondered how we could use this visceral awareness, if at all. Professor Latif stepped carefully through the sitting pairs and looked at each one with great pleasure. As seeds of connection, you are to plant this awareness and connection into the people you will soon meet. It is the same way that you learned, but instead of your communities who were working together to nurture this, you are going into a world that has been carefully growing its ideas of individuality and personal presence. They do not know what we have been working on. Shadin sat up straighter. She felt the nervousness radiate from Arfat, the youngest student in the group. He was the only one to have been born into their community as it was learning communal entanglement. He had always lived with the background hum of the community and had never known a life of isolated mental individualism. Professor Latif continued. This is the brink of something wonderful. You have experienced how natural our connection feels, and it will get deeper and more meaningful the more we do it. We can harness the power of the great power of community. We have done this here. There is no need for the great convulsion and chaos of a revolution or an apocalypse. We have shown that there is a better way, a gentler way.
Thank you so much. I really enjoy how you bring how you speak about that visceral awareness and your ways of sort of alchemically recycling some of the more shadow aspects of human life into something that can bring us to a deeper level of consciousness and awareness. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm very excited to introduce Chris Reedy. He is a transdisciplinary academic who draws on sociological and political theory, futures thinking, and transformative science to design, facilitate, and evaluate practical experiments in transformative change towards sustainable futures. And as a teenager, he dreamed of being a novelist, but took a different path into academia, driven by a love for the natural world and hoped to alleviate the suffering he witnessed during international travels. And Chris is a professor of sustainability governance at the Institute for Sustainable Futures in Sydney, Australia, and will be reading from his story, The Witnesses. Over to you.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for coming along, everyone. Lovely to see you all here. So, I crouched in the corner of a tiny, cramped room, mud under my bare feet, a tin wall rattling at my back. A woman and 4 children huddled with me, terror shining in their eyes, their bright clothing soaked through and blotched with filth. The noise was visceral, a howling wind and pounding rain that shook our cramped shelter. The tin roof jumped and clanged back into place, then with a great tearing sound it lifted away. The din intensified and rain pounded my skin. I crawled through the mud toward the door, but before I could get there, it burst open and a torrent of brown, debris-filled water rushed in. The force knocked me into a corner. I tried to get to my feet, but could make no headway against the powerful flow. I reached for the others and clung to them as the room filled and my vision blurred. I pounded the wall with desperation once, twice, but it made no impression. Distorted by the water now filling the room, I looked into the face of a little girl as she opened her mouth in search of air and gulped filthy water instead. I opened my own mouth to scream. The world tilted as the wall behind me collapsed and my vision faded into black. I tore off my set and light flooded back in, illuminating the familiar surroundings of my room. What the hell was that? It felt so real, I said. It was real. You just died, mate. Jed's voice floated over my shoulder from behind me. What do you mean? I said, turning to face him. It's the latest thing, he said. It's called a scene. They pay some poor schmuck in Bangladesh or somewhere a few bucks to have a VCam implanted that uploads the footage. Seriously? Who'd agree to something like that? I thought maybe he was winding me up. You'd be surprised, mate. Life's tough over there. Surgery's really simple, no big risk. And the money can make all the difference when you've got a family to feed. Heaps of people have gone for it. They give up a bit of privacy to survive. Of course, Jed continued, most of the footage is rubbish. Life in the third world isn't exactly riveting entertainment. But when something big happens, like those Bangladeshi floods or a resource war, they comb through the footage, pull out the best stuff and sell it to rich kids like us who are looking for a thrill. No way. Are people really that desperate? Another thought occurred to me. Who's they? I don't know, but it's all over the dark web. Not just storms and floods either. There's all sorts of bad shit from the third world, Jed said. They must be raking it in for that one, though. Have you ever felt anything like it? Never. Don't you think it's kind of sick, though? They're living off the misery of those poor people. Jed was unmoved. Sure, but it's not like they're being forced to do it. It's a good deal for the cameras if they survive. And if they're dead, what do they care who sees the footage? Check out this site if you want to see more, but be careful. That one was pretty tame compared to some of the stuff out there. Images of children's faces, distorted by muddy water, haunted my sleep that night. In the morning, I took to the web to find out more about what I had seen. Everything I could find indicated it was genuine footage from the recent Bangladesh floods. I'd heard about them in the news, tens of thousands dead, millions displaced. But in a sea of bad news, those numbers had meant little to me. Somehow, it was different now. Those numbers had faces, families. Each was a moment of horror, followed by blackness. I struggled with my conscience for a while. Did I really want to be a voyeur into those broken lives? But the scene had moved something in me, like nothing else had in a long time. It was a shocking glimpse of reality, so foreign from my sheltered world. I didn't feel good about it, but I went looking for more.
Right on. Thank you, Chris. I also, in the same way that I really enjoy the way that Saher's story brings out sort of some of those darker aspects of humanity and brings them into a new capacity for empathy through the sympathetic use of technology and the ways that we can connect to each other, and the way that you shed some light in dark terrain. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Anne to bring us into our panel discussion, so we can start to dig into some of these ideas. Over to you, Anne.
Thanks very much, Nicole, and wonderful to hear from the artists themselves, the authors themselves, and great to see everyone here. I thought I'd start off by asking the authors about a common theme that runs through all the stories, and that is one of connection, reconnection, whether it be reconnection with community, reconnection with country, reconnection with the other, perhaps. And so that psychological element, I was wondering, working the shadows, the violence against women that Saher mentioned, the reckoning with colonisation, the wasteland of our soul, in the form of the hungry ghost, transmuting voyeurism in Chris's case and shutting out the world. To what extent, or how do the ways that you've incorporated those psychological elements reflect your own relationship to climate change or the climate crisis? And in the process of formulating your story, perhaps also if you could share with us some of the process by which the story brought forth solution or possibility spaces, because that was evident in all the stories. So perhaps if you could speak to that, we would love to hear from you. Don't know who wants to go first.
I could start.
Thanks, Kelli.
Thank you. That's, interesting, good questions. And I love how all the stories approach this from such radically different perspectives and contexts. It's such an inspiring project in general. And I guess for me, Arlo, the main character, who's a 12-year-old boy who doesn't want to be there and has tuned out and has numbed himself from his kind of, when he was younger, he was passionate about the environment and had volunteered for a wildlife rehabilitation center. And then his parents worked for a environmental research institute. And he just becomes so scared of all the bad news that he takes refuge in numbness and video games and friends. And and then on the other hand, there's this charming, magical Aunt Bloom with one eye who tells these stories and, is passionately alive. And I guess for me, it's obviously a personal experience of oscillating between those two sides. And I think every day or every week, maybe I'm feeling more Arlo or more Aunt Bloom, depending on my mood. So I would say that the process of writing the story gave me kind of an anchoring metaphor that feels hopeful. I don't necessarily follow hope in the linear sense. I kind of follow the Meg Wheatley school of giving up hope and doing what needs to be done anyway. So like, what is it that gives you power and joy and purpose without having to have hope? And so for me, this story was a process of reconciling this, and the kind of the concept of the Cosmos Mariners and the quantum social change is that it doesn't matter. All acts of kindness, once you've taken this kind of, quote unquote vow, commitment to spreading this kind of joy and beauty and kindness, then it ripples out in unimaginable ways. And it's not really up to us to figure it out. So that was.
As Aunt Bloom says, it starts with yes. Why not say it now? She said to the 12-year-old boy. Yeah,
Yeah.
That was a lovely anchor. Yeah. Thank you. If I can ask the other authors to weigh in. Jessica?
I'm happy to jump in. So maybe mine's a bit different. I didn't get into the extract, but the second part of the story is this relationship between a child and her grandmother, and it's a kind of coming of age story. And it's set, many years into the future. And so this child is on behalf of all kind of beings experiencing intergenerational trauma, and so she in a way has been chosen to channel this. And I think there are people who are especially sensitive to the world, and in many ways are able to transform things for others. So that was part of it. And then this entanglement with her grandmother, who is the kind of wisdom being, in that she's deeply empathetic to her granddaughter, but she can't go through the process for her. So she's witnessing it, and she's there with her. And I feel that maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's growing up in South Africa, or that we're living in such complex worlds of different relations and different power dynamics, that each of us has a different kind of role to play. And I mean, Chris is called the witness, but in a way we're all witnesses, and it's through that empathy, I guess, that things are possible. And for me, the other part that I really loved about writing the story was exploring the non-human world, and how Cape Town is an extremely elemental city. We have, fires raging, the sea is huge. It's, we're in the heart of the ozone hole. And so allowing that elemental part of the world to infuse us as humans, and to relate to other species in not kind of anthropomorphic ways, but genuine ways, really trying to see and read and understand and relate to non-human beings in this world. And then maybe lastly, that climate change, I feel, is in a way it's a gift, because it's revealing what's already there in the human condition. And it's doing it, the same way COVID is now. It's doing it so terribly in showing up these inequalities and this difficulty we have of being, conscious, smart, clever beings in this world. And it's allowing us to see that and respond. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before we go on, I just wanted to say that all of us enjoyed that transformative element where you talk about transforming the difficult parts of your personality, and it fits in well with the transformation that's needed. Even though the climate crisis is slow onset, the transformation we need will be rapid. So, and you call it the conscious integral age. I'm sure you've got a few people there with that lovely metaphor and hook. If I could open it up to Saher, Jude, and Chris, please.
I can take that forward a bit. So like we always talk about climate change as this huge complex thing. And even in my work where we deal with food systems, which is everything around food. So not just the agriculture, everything that brings food to us. And I feel like as, if you're talking about these concepts to normal, regular people outside the warm, on fire cocoon of academia, then all of these concepts are so huge that it doesn't feel personal enough. And we always have that discussion of how do we communicate these concepts while making it a personal problem, because it very much is. It affects all of us and will affect the future. But then like with our other work, like we always talk about our interventions as the next 5 years and the next 10 years. and the idea of caring for generations that haven't yet come, 10 plus or 31 million generations, it just doesn't occur to us because we don't have that empathy. And far from having the empathy for all the people who are currently suffering, like, COVID and conflict, and it just keeps coming on. So how do we think about the change we want to make while having that big encompassing empathy and feeling for everyone? And I don't know how many of you have been in like really crowded cities in the developing world where when you're walking through the city, you feel the city. Like, New York has a feeling, Karachi has a feeling. And I feel like that is very much not just emblematic of, but the fact that we are all human, like that shows that, all of us have had those moments of you're thinking of a friend for a few days and then they call you. So, like that's very anecdotal, but if we spread out that visceral awareness of the other individuals around us, that is highly complex as well. So I feel like climate change is too complex is very much a cop-out. There is so much complexity in our everyday life, our everyday experience as a normal living person, that if that becomes a normal part of us, then why not? So we don't have to think about grim futures of the post-urban or the post-community, but all of it is part of the human experience. So that is kind of where it came from, and then became something else with like a graveyard for buildings and like growing algae. So yeah, lots of weird things happened eventually.
Thanks very much for that thoughtful contribution, Saher. If I could pass the baton on.
Yeah, the approach I took was very much based on an artistic focus that I had on our water future anyway. And I was developing a project just to, that was a sensory project that could identify for each person their personal relationship with water. And so through extension of that is an understanding of, in a climate change context, what is my agenda of care as an artist? The works that I develop are experimental and they're participatory. And so what am I inviting people into, and what is the agenda of care that speaks to our relationship with water in this context? And then in terms of the story, that was getting together a think tank of artists and climate scientists, researchers, close to water, which was the river that I mentioned. And as part of an agenda of care, particularly in the Australian context, it's really important to do some truth telling and understand where repair takes place. And 2018 was Year of Indigenous Language. And I was kind of fascinated about the relationship between climate change, Indigenous language, oneness, which was another part of the agenda of care that we had established, and how we could navigate that by forgetting everything that we knew in going to this place and just being by a body of water, part of that body of water, understanding it from the perspective of a First Nation custodian and understanding their language around that. So it was a way, it was a bit like the Bengali. It was, what is the story that's going to hold the water and to be the fundamental element in going forward? That means that we could speak to this agenda of care in creating works for audiences that spoke of their relationship with the water and to climate change.
Thanks very much, Jude, for that contribution. And on to you, Chris.
Yeah, it's so lovely to hear what all the other authors were thinking when writing the stories, because all I've had to read so far was the stories. So thank you. I think in mine, in terms of sort of the relationship with climate change, I feel like climate change is shot through with dilemmas. And in the story, I was trying to bring out some of those dilemmas and perhaps look for ways that they could be turned into positive forces. And so, you know, in this, those dilemmas are things like technology is positioned as the kind of savior, you know, renewable energy and so on is going to save us from climate change, but technology has also got us into this mess. So there's this sense of, you know, technology is a dual-edged sword, and so the technology of the scenes in my story is like that. It starts off in quite a dark place, quite a voyeuristic place, and but through the window into other people's lives that brings, it opens up the possibility of change and transformation for the people engaging in those practices. And I mean, that connected for me back to personal experiences when traveling through southern countries, and as sort of somebody not long out of university and quite naive about the world, and experiencing what other lives were like and the shattering impact that had on me. And that really drove me to the kind of work that I'm doing now. And so we hear about climate change as something that's distant in time, it's going to affect future generations, it's distant in space, it's affecting people in other places. And that the technology in the story was a way to bring the experience that others are having with climate change already right now and bring it into the worlds of people that might be quite insulated from it right now because of their wealth and privilege, and to sort of provide a way that to shatter that privilege and create some impetus for transformation.
Yodunji, I think that's how you say thank you in Dharawal, courtesy of Jude. So I'd like to, for the second round, draw upon a question asked by Eleanor in chat, and that is that in terms of your pasts or your backgrounds as authors, activists, academics, how do you think using this approach more widely might be more effective in reaching more people outside your normal audiences? You know, perhaps some of you could speak to that.
Yeah, I'll just speak very briefly to it. I think it's asking, dealing with the future and stories. It's really about setting up a context for asking new questions. So the approach that I take is that I don't know the answers, but collectively, if we propose a context where people feel safe in asking new questions, then you can be really propositional with that.
Thanks, Jude.
I mean, I would say more stories, more better, but I have a bias. Also, I think like stories work quite well for greater situational awareness. So partly what Jude said as well, like, you know, it helps understand and build the context. And besides just proposing questions, it can be a very good way of communicating some of the more difficult answers. As someone who works with data all the time, like data is amazing, but there are so many different ways that can be presented, that can be shared, it can be taken. And stories connect with us at a deeper level. I think that a lot of other communication methods might not, whether it's written, said out loud, you know, in a Netflix show. I think it's better.
Yeah, I think people are much more likely to be motivated to change their practices by when something connects with their emotions than when you try and rationally convince somebody through a factual presentation. But I think the other power of stories is in not just telling stories, but having people tell their own stories and share their stories and generate stories themselves about how they might respond to challenges like climate change. And then through sharing those stories, we learn a lot about each other and what our common ground might be. And I think we need to find a lot of that common ground if we're going to respond effectively to this challenge.
Kelli, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Sure. I think that there's a lot of research out there that shows how powerful stories are. And specifically in my research, I look at the role of metaphorical thinking kind of and framing from George Lakoff and Johnson, this idea that even our fundamental linguistic skills and ways of making sense of the world are metaphorical. So stories have that power to repopulate our metaphorical world. And I look at it as, in my imagination, we have this landscape of our imaginary, and how can we regenerate our landscape of our imaginations, our collective imaginations? We need it to be richer, more diverse, new species evolving in the landscape of imagination, I think, before it manifests in the tangible. And this is an aspect of the quantum change that I think we can't predict how the story can transform us.
Jessica? Yeah, maybe also for me, so I've spent a lot of my kind of activist life trying to persuade people climate change is real, or at least, the first 10 years of it. And a story is amazing because you can just put that as a given. You don't have to, so it becomes the context in which we act, and it provides, I think, the potential for much more boldness through seeing characters do small things that can have amazing consequences. So in a way, it just gives people permission or license to experiment and to be brave where they might feel impotent otherwise. So yeah, and as a writer, you can work with characters and parts of yourself that you struggle with, and you can let them do things that you might be nervous to do, and see that it's okay, and I think that the story allows that possibility in a wonderful way.
Thank you. I might just ask one more question, because you've already preempted, Kelli, the question of social change, quantum social change, but please, if you want to go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, oh gosh. I forgot what I was saying. Go ahead.
That's right. It'll come back to you. So there'll be an opportunity. So I'll just ask one more question, because there's some other great questions coming through, and I'll hand back to Nicole and to Karen. But if I could ask, because an important part of our anthology is quantum social change, and it's not just another anthology about the climate, and we want to be a bit more hopeful and to envision more enriching possibilities for our imaginaries rather than depleting ones. So was just wondering then, how did you come up with your concept for approaching quantum reality in your narrative? What was your way in, so to speak? Jessica?
I mean, mine's right up front in the story. So my way in was the Cape Town drought, and seeing this unbelievable response, or the potential response of people who were so compassionate and caring and working in neighborhoods like it had never happened before. And we've seen that now under COVID, but it was like a kind of precursor. And imagining that kind of rippled out, and the kind of simultaneity of that happening all over the world. So the sudden shift of this just very small action of saying to your neighbor, can I help you carry water? Became, just said, wow, okay, we can just turn that so quick, and it happened so quickly. So that was the one. And then the second in was, I mentioned briefly, was the kind of entanglement between a grandchild and her grandmother, which I think is also a very, it's an old, it's not from quantum physics. That's, we know that happens, but it provided a kind of mechanism or a tool to be able to have that conversation between those two generations. Thanks.
Kelli, did you remember what you were going to say?
Yes, I was going to say that also the process of writing stories, I think, can help, even if they're never published, can help people become more self-critical or more critical of narratives that are out there. So when you're writing a narrative and you see what you want to include and the kinds of mindsets that you want to include, like I want to make sure that I highlight the sentience and the ability of trees to be cosmos mariners, or the small acts of saving a baby owl or being brave. So then when you look at other stories, you can start to see what's included and what's not included. Like in Harry Potter, which I enjoy, but certainly the natural world is very separate. It's not a part of the story. Future generations, past generations, how are those included? What are the sub themes of other stories that populate our imagination?
Thanks, Kelly. So Saher, Jude, and Chris to round us out.
Yeah, I guess I borrowed two metaphors from quantum physics. So one was the idea of entanglement, which we've heard plenty about, and I wanted to entangle the lives of people in the North and people in the South through the sort of technology of the scenes in the story, and see what emerged from that entanglement, and what positive transformation could come from us better understanding ourselves on this planet. And then the other was the idea of particle wave duality in physics, and the darkness and the light that is in everything. And so not trying to write a future that was either blindly utopian or darkly dystopian. And we have plenty of the latter, and the former can seem a little naive, a little bit, how would you actually get there? How would that be possible? And so it was trying to navigate a middle ground that felt a bit more realistic, where we recognize both the dark and the light in people. And so in the way that the technology of scenes is first used in the story, it's quite dark, but there's a lightness that emerges from that over time, which of course wasn't in my extract, so I only read the dark bit.
Thanks, Chris. Jude and Saher?
Sure. Thanks, by the way, for the opportunity to speak to this, because this was something that I had never considered ahead of writing this. And my way into it was to look at the doing and the being and the speculating and also reflecting in an instant of time, and to use that instant to look at how deep time and time of the now and time that is filled with potential might all work. And then what I did was to play with scale. So, for example, placed within the deep time and going forward was scales of observation, and then languages trying to work together to construct a kind of language that spoke to social change somehow. So I went about it as a kind of, I guess you would say in biology, as a border object, and sat by the border of the river and then looked at how that instant could hold something quantic in it that might speak to social change. So it was a lot of fun, and I left out a lot of the expanding, as Chris did, a lot of the expansion, and then bringing it down to an instant, and then the sonics and that sort of thing. But that's what I explored through your really wonderful proposition. So thanks.
Thanks, Jude. Saher?
I wish my answer sounded half as intelligent as all of those. But my way in was in two different ways. So I have a continuing series of stories which will never be published or seen by any other human. But most of my stories always have one person. So there's nobody else, it's always one person. And I try to experiment with the different ways that deconstructive processes of nature can do good things. So, partly it's the lichen working on breaking down buildings and that can bring life. And I was reflecting on the joy of lots of shared experiences. So you can hear the call for prayer behind me. And we've just passed through entire month of Ramadan, and trying to explain the joy that a whole community feels over 30 days of fasting through incredible heat is difficult, but it's a shared experience that can be extremely joyful and very happy. And so when I saw the prompt, it was a very wonderful way to bring those two completely disparate themes together, because I think that might be part of the future. But yeah, it was a very messy, completely disorganized way in, but I think I got there somehow.
I think it was messy for everyone, but that's very thoughtful. Thanks, Saher. I'm going to hand back to Nicole now. Thanks everyone for your great contributions.
Right. Thank you all so much. So before we move into this writing exercise, I just want to quickly acknowledge our incredible visual artists who each contributed an image to accompany the stories. And so these are Danielle Eubank, David Cass, Tanya Bjordum, who's on the call with us, Jill Hoyu, and Anne Rose Georgeson. And so each of their images in my mind, really helped to lift up each of the stories through color and line and just provide yet another way into quantum social change. So thank you all for your work. So as Kelli was saying, we can't predict the effect that a story will have on us. And I think for everyone as writers in the room, you can't predict what the act of writing might bring out in you as well. And as Karen was mentioning, even the process or the act of thinking through what a quantum reality feels like in your body can be very evocative for bringing up solution spaces. So I just wanted to invite everybody who's in the audience with us to take all of these wonderful ideas forward that were shared in the panel, ideas of interspecies connections and empathetic connection through technology, deep time, simultaneity, and just drop those in as seeds of inspiration. And we'll take a couple minutes to just do a bit of free writing on what it might feel like to acknowledge that we live in a quantum reality. So I'm just going to type the prompt in. Our sort of overarching prompt is, if you were to realize tomorrow that you existed in a quantum world, what would that look like and feel like? And what would be different and what would be the same? So I'm just going to drop that in, and then we can take a couple minutes to reflect on that before we come back together. Okay, and so thank you for joining us on that exploration. Before we start to close, is there anything that any of our viewers would like to share about that experience of writing? Anything that came up for you in terms of envisioning or realizing quantum social change reality?
Reflection is hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, oh, I see a raised hand. Nick maybe?
Yeah, hello. Thank you
Hello.
very much for sharing. Where I got to immediately started was a feeling that I sort of wrote about in the thread anyway, which is a feeling that this is an experience, what we're having now, of quantum reality, because you guys are all over the world and you're certainly not here. And then what that led me to is being present to this morning, which is something that happened by happenstance to me then I got to go on and do something else next, and I've been imbued by this, and that will therefore have an impact on what I do next. And then I started to imagine the people affected by what I do next, what would then happen to them. And so it didn't seem like science fiction. It just felt like this is what we're already in. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I've heard a couple people bring forward the idea of the computer just sort of being another metaphor for our presence and our connection to each other right now, all over the globe. So thank you for animating that thought. I think it's true. It's happening right now. Maybe I'll turn it over to Karen to bring us to our closing.
Great. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you everybody for, it was just fascinating to listen to the story, listen to the authors talking about the story after reading the stories. And this is really the first time we've met. And in doing the writing exercise, I had the same kind of feelings or experiences as Nick, like this is like sitting around a campfire. We are Cosmos Mariners. Wow. And also realizing in reflecting and, the importance of that self-reflection, but I kind of think that inspiration is the renewable energy that we're looking for to move us forward in time, that being able to, like, going back to what Jude said about caring for others becomes super important right now, and being able to like have these ripples of experiences. And I think in Saher, in your story, you talked about like the breaking the shock of breaking the entanglement, like collapsing the way back into our material reality, and we go on and we do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, but recognizing that, wow, we actually matter in the moment, and that this is a relational universe. And I think that this is super inspiring, and bringing in the idea that I think it was Jude mentioned about like opening up new questions. And Albert Einstein had once said, don't listen to the person who has the answer, listen to the person who has the questions. And which I think is super important, just to like open up what our perspectives are. But David Bohm also reminds us that in scientific inquiries, a crucial step is to ask the right question. I think that kind of thing is just like, what questions are we asking right now? Are we asking the ones, not, to me, it's not the whether we can transform, but really how. And so all the stories I think are have given so many perspectives on the multiple ways of approaching these issues. And I agree with Saher that like we can't just bend down and say, oh, this is all too complex, because that's actually not taking responsibility, like our ability to respond in the moment. And so on that note, we're just we are really excited to have another webinar next Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning, where we have the other 4 authors, some of who are on the call here: Catherine Sarah Young, Albert van Wingorden, Julia Sanchez Henkel, and Otter Liefe will be talking about their 4 stories. And we'll be going through the same kind of, having these types of discussions. And I feel like it is a really important moment to be talking about these types of stories and processes. And I almost feel like ready to go, like put out a call for another round of stories, because I feel like that's what we need at this moment. So I thank you all for joining, and we will have a recording available, and encourage you to write your own stories, and the pen to paper, and because we will have that call coming out again soon. So yeah, with that, we have 5 minutes. If anyone of the authors would like to add anything. So yeah.
I just want to give a quick shameless plug for another anthology that should be published this, in a few months, by Babidi Blue Libros in Spain. And it's a compilation of middle grade or early middle grade fiction. And my story is also in this compilation from a research project about sustainable place shaping. And each of the 6 stories is based on one of the researchers' cases or themes, like green care or circular economy and composting food systems, about a brave carrot that is looking for the compost, and commenting of a girl that goes back and learns about listening to the trees and about the commenting practices in Portugal. And it's called Once Upon the Future. And so you can find it on Facebook, we have a page, Once Upon the Future. But it's in this the spirit of what you're doing also. So.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I think that if anyone else has any plugs for books that are coming out, I'm finally finishing my You Matter More Than You Think, Quantum Social Change for a Thriving World, which has been a 6-year project, but it's like finally like, okay, it's going into that reality. And one thing I really wanted to point out that is probably visible from our conversations, that the idea that like we have researchers and then we have artists or researchers and writers, that there's a real, like many of the stories are from people working in research or in activism and things. And so our multiple identities and personalities comes through really nicely in these stories. So does anyone else have anything to add or plug before we sign off and say? Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next.
Sorry, Tuna wanted to say something.
Okay, great. Tuna.
Hi, I'm Tone. I'm very short. I just, it was about this quantum world, how it would look like. And I think that we all have a certain sense of connection. And then as an artist, I try to deeply understand patterns and structures in nature and to communicate that out. And I think that in front of an artwork, or when you've read a story or something like that, any kind of artwork, we carry that artwork around with us in our thoughts. And that's a very powerful way of entanglement that we share.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know what to say. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that Tona and I have been working together on this book project, and she contributed to our Entangled Future. And yeah, and I think that like to think about ourselves as creative and as being able to, as entangled, is really a powerful, not just metaphor, but meaning. It makes our mattering meaningful. So thank you for that, Tona. And again, thank you for all for joining us in this webinar. We really look forward to seeing you next week if you can make it. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are in the world.